morning, everyone. Great to have you here. It's the first day of Construction Summit. It's beautiful weather in Hamburg. This is a premiere, also because this is the first time we have a panel here at the Construction Summit which is conducted in English. And I'm very happy about this because I think it definitely makes sense to also get some more outside perspectives into our German-speaking market. So let me quickly introduce our panel. So we have Fede. You're originally from Ethiopia, right? Addis Ababa, that's where you studied. And then you moved to Zurich, Munich, and then also Zurich to do your PhD at the ETH on industrialized construction, exactly the topic we're going to be talking about today. And now you work with Implenia in supply chain and product management. Then we have three gentlemen here, a French, an American, and a Brit, which could actually be the beginning of a very funny joke, right? But we have actually Marc, who is the Chief Strategy Officer and Division Head at Nemetschek, so in the Executive Committee of Nemetschek in Munich, originally from France, and working in the industry as well with Schneider before. We have Martin, originally from the Midwest in the US, now moved to the Midwest of Europe, Brussels, right, and working with his own company, ToGatherHomes. And we have David, who's from England, right? A Brit, now living in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and Switzerland, and with a lot of experience in industrialized construction, now with his own consulting firm with the name of ID&C, which is based in Riyadh. So before we start, I just want to ask you, because you obviously did your PhD in industrialized construction and you worked for 4 years on this topic, can you define industrialized construction for us? And also maybe, put it in the same framework as all these other words we hear: MMC, DFEM, DFMA, serielles Bauen, modulares Bauen. I mean, prefab, offsite, onsite. I mean, there's so many words out there which are, I have the feeling, sometimes not used properly. So, can you give us a short explanation of what industrialized construction is and what it's not?
For sure. So, I would say it's an alternative and emerging approach to traditional construction, which we know is a project-based approach, whereas with industrialized construction, you have a product-based approach. Okay, instead of a project-based approach, we have a product-based approach. And all the synonyms that you've mentioned, I would say, are, let's say, comprehensively can be included in industrialized construction. And what is different there is that maybe the characteristics of industrialized construction is there is high level of predefinition of your technical platform, as well as your process platform. This includes what is your customer, identifying your customer, high level of focus on the customer that you're addressing, which products do you want to push forward, how do you standardize those, as well as how do you work with partners, meaning that you have more integrated supply chain design in industrialized construction compared to traditional construction. You also have a high opportunity to reuse knowledge because of the standardization and repeatability of the processes and the technical systems that you use, and hence you can continuously improve your products from version to version. I would say that those are the characteristics that define industrialized construction.
Okay, I mean, you're also in this for a long time now. Would you add anything, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much about the way of working. So it's as much about collaboration between the key stakeholders, the developer, the architect, the engineer, the contractor, the manufacturer, working together in a way to use the available technology, so both digital technologies but also the manufacturing technologies, and using them together in a way that allows you to deliver faster, cheaper, more sustainably, higher quality, greater number of assets. But it's very much about the way of working and collaboration for us.
Okay. And Martin, I mean, you worked in New York, right? As I understood, you were in urban planning. You did this master at Harvard, on urban planning in New York. So the question is, what we see today, is it just like a repackaging of old concepts, stuff that we've seen before, and just give it a new name, and it's basically the same stuff as we've seen in the 60s maybe, or in the communist era, or maybe in other places, also in the US?
I don't think it's the same thing that we've seen before. And I don't think that governments and industry is seeing it as the same thing as before. You think about mandates for BIM usage in the UK, prefabrication in Japan. what's coming through European channels, and even a survey out now. I think there's a survey available on industrialized construction until March 19th through DG Grow at the European Commission to hear from all of you, hear from all of us about how we can help change this industry. So I don't think it's new. I think it's actually getting smarter, better, and faster. And there's an adoption and an adherence that's happening unlike before.
Okay. So are we, Marc, you have a good overview, like from the work that you've done with Schneider, but also now with Nemetschek, obviously. So what's your perspective? Is this just a hype, another hype, and we basically go through the trough of disappointment again, or is this really lasting? So will we see this kind of as a new way of construction?
I don't think it's a hype. I think it's just an evolution of a few concepts that were already known, but probably the imperative, or let's say the context for change was maybe not as strong as it is today. So I would say it's an evolution and hopefully an acceleration, but not a hype curve, let's say.
Okay. So, of course.
I think one of the challenges is that there's still a lot of misunderstanding of what industrialized design and construction is. And as a result, there's a lack of experience. And so for every project that's being done well, and we see some great examples of this, there are 2 or 3 projects which are still being done badly because they're not adopting a fundamentally different approach. They see it as an incremental improvement, an incremental change. They follow a more business as usual approach to architecture and engineering, and then they just try to get it manufactured at the end. And so I think it's exactly as Marc says, it's evolving slowly because we don't have enough experience yet, and people continue to make experience. And we need to leverage those good experiences to learn from them and understand that it's a fundamentally different way of working. It's not just an incremental change to design and delivery of buildings.
So, just taking up that point, obviously we're at 2%, right? If you just look at the market share of what's industrialized, prefabricated, offsite, however you want to call it, is right now compared to the whole market volume is only 2%, right? It's peanuts. It's nothing. So I'm just wondering, why does, I get it. It's an evolution. It will take time, right? But how much time? If we continue like this, it will probably take 100 years, right, to actually get to a level where we could call the industry construction industrialized.
There's a crisis in a whole host of areas. There's a crisis in housing across Europe. And governments, local national governments, local governments, and the EU are taking steps with a task force for affordable housing at the EU Commission, with focuses in Ireland, England, and across Western Europe on industrialized construction, innovation in construction, educating people. I think in the UK, in the next 5 years, they need 251,000 new construction laborers. They don't exist. They're not going to exist. So how is that going to be addressed? It's going to be addressed through prefabrication, industrial solutions, and leveraging technologies that exist but haven't been adopted to the degree that they can be.
So if you look at GCs, you're working for a GC, right? General contractor. So what I see, sometimes I have the feeling when I look at them, the kind of their industrialized construction initiatives feel a bit like a TED Talk, It's inspiring, it's great, it's shiny, it's great visuals, it's a great thing to talk about with your friends, at the golf club or whatever, but it's not really making a difference. So what's your take on this? A company like Implenia, right? You do a lot of stuff in that space. Does it really move the needle within your company? Do you see more regular construction projects that are now moving to, let's say, a higher share of prefabrication?
I think in our group, within Implenia, it's a very small group and a small unit, so this is really not what Implenia does, right, the product approach. So I wouldn't judge, per se, the company as a whole, because it's not based on a product approach, right? Where I am working in a small team that tries to innovate and push this product approach into the projects of Implenia, for sure, and there are several hurdles to that. One is, of course, convincing the clients that already have worked with traditional construction and convincing them be it in terms of financial benefits, sustainability benefits, and so on, how they're able to benefit if they were to use our product approach. So there's still a room within the bigger GCs that you said are using traditional construction to adopt industrialized construction. But if you take a look at other companies that already from the onset have the product approach in mind, then they have a higher, let's say, market share than we do currently.
Okay. What's your take on this? I mean, you also worked on the GC side of the business as well.
So I think we target real estate developers because they're the ones who have the money and they're the ones who dictate the way the project is going to be set up. And they have a huge influence over whether or not the projects are going to turn out successfully. I think, Martin's right, that the pressures to increase productivity are increasing all the time. At the same time, we've got, what's very exciting, we've got a younger generation of digital natives coming through who are not yet in positions of significant authority in developers or in general contractors. But over the next few years, they're going to move into those positions, and they're simply not going to tolerate working the way that we work today. They're going to expect digital in everything, and if it's not there, they're going to deploy it, they're going to look for it, they're going to be reaching out to the people at these kind of events to find solutions to the problems that they're frustrated with. And that's why I don't think it's hype either. I think it's, we've got this tidal wave of young people coming through who want somewhere to live as well. So there's a sense of purpose in this, who are going to transform the business that they work for, or those businesses are going to fade away because they'll be overtaken by the businesses that do change.
Okay, interesting. So, you work in Saudi Arabia, and you've also seen with your previous jobs, you have also seen other regions like China, obviously in the UK, where you're from. And Marc, are you traveling a lot now for your business? Or you just said you're kind of, after this, you're going to Scandinavia and so on. So who's leading? Which region is leading in that space? Where do you have most discussions with regards to industrialized construction from an MHEC perspective?
From an MHEC perspective, obviously, it's about the way software can help the constraints or the new, let's say, the new norms that would come out of industrialized construction. And if I would have to summarize, first of all, we have very high empathy and sympathy for general contractors because the change is on their side is huge. Processes, people-wise. It's a systemic change for a GC. So our role as a software is just to let evolve a software that was made to design, to build, now to design, to manufacture and assemble on site, which is a completely different logic in the way we need to integrate with manufacturing capabilities, the way we need to integrate as well the software and the logic with supply chain elements, new quality also, new quality processes, and that's a huge change on our side, and that's what keeps us awake at night. How we could the best support the entire value chain.
But where do you see, like in geographic regions, where would you say is the one where you see most advances?
Our exposure is mostly US and Europe, but we have to recognize that also China is an advanced country, especially in affordable housing programs, with high level of industrialization and productization of the built environment. So I would say different geographies in the world, different reason why to move to productize and modularize the topic.
I think there's something that they have in common, though, whether you look at the UK, Saudi Arabia, Singapore, or China, and that's the role of government. The role of government in all of this. Right? There's an enormous economic opportunity to industrialize design and construction, the opportunity both to deliver more infrastructure and housing, but also to capture more value. And I think if you look at the language, particularly the UK government is using, it's about creating new industry. If you look at the language the Saudi government they're about creating new industry. It's not just about cheaper, faster, better quality. It's about a new industrial capability that they can then export. And for a country like Germany, which has such a deep and long history of industrialization, that has this very strong automotive sector, It's an obvious economic opportunity for Germany, and especially as there is here quite an extensive off-site manufacturing capability at different levels of maturity. But it's an enormous economic opportunity, and some governments see that and are trying to organize themselves to capitalize on that opportunity.
Let's take Saudi, because that's also where you live, right? I mean, when you look at NEOM and all these other big projects, they sometimes seem a bit more like PR, like big headlines, 170-kilometer long line building, and then of course in another PR, in another announcement, they basically said it's going to be a lot shorter. Sometimes looking from here, it feels a bit like it's a lot of PR, right? And at the end, it doesn't materialize. So how does it actually look on the ground? And you said like they're building this new industry. I mean, I think it's a completely different story if you have a 170-kilometer building which you need to supply to, or if it's just 200 meters long, right? Or 2 kilometers or what it is now. So like, how does it look like on the ground?
NEOM is a very specific project which has a very specific set of challenges. I think more broadly though, when you look across the kingdom, there is a very clear industrial policy to industrialize design and construction, because they have a very young generation, a very young population, 60% under 30. They need millions of units of housing. They're very keen to attract more international visitors, both as tourists and pilgrims to the kingdom. And consequently, there's much more tourism infrastructure which is needed. And so while you have some of these more spectacular projects, which certainly are very exciting, there is a very significant, if you like, base load of more traditional residential and tourism assets that are all very well suited to a manufacturing approach, which have to be delivered because the economic transformation is part of a national strategy, and they have this very young population that wants places to live. Okay, so but then, so the projects that we don't read about here, they still exist, right? So there's still, yes. I mean, it's also happening. Very much so, yes. It's very much happening, and I encourage people to go and have a look for yourself, and stick a toe in the water and understand the level of transformation that they're trying to embark on in delivering just an incredible portfolio of buildings and projects. Do you see any German companies down there? Like, how are they? Not so much. There's probably overweight on companies from the UK and the US. Okay. So, yeah. So still some room for improvement for the yes. For the German industry. Okay. So now talking about regulation, since you just said this kind of a national policy, to develop affordable housing or housing in general in Saudi Arabia. I mean, Martin, interesting. You as an American are living in Brussels and are also quite involved in kind of the EU policies and EU Commission activities and so on with regards to affordable housing. So do you see regulation? Obviously, there's a lot of discussion. EU is good at regulation. Sometimes I think it's just not fair, because it's obviously harmonization of 27 different legal systems, but that's a different story. But do you see now regulation as an obstacle, or do you see it as an opportunity?
So last November, the Commission implemented the Housing Affordability Unit under Dan Jorgensen in Energy and Housing. They formed a task force, I think, 3 weeks ago, and I was able to meet with the head of that task force that week that they first formed. And the good news is that the discussion of new regulation was minimized. The idea of incentives, the idea of financial platforms to enable was really the focus. And I was really happy to hear that. The people who are now joining this task force coming from other units within the EU, like DG GROW, I just mentioned the survey. Everybody's got to find the survey. We should get it out to everybody so that you can comment on industrialized construction. But the idea here is to leverage the European Investment Bank, not to mandate what happens at the local level, because we all know that housing construction happens at the local level. But somebody else who's in this space said recently in an interview, if there's a product that's been certified in 3 different locations in the same country, why can't it then be certified for the entire country instead of having to wait market by market? A fire burns the same in Vienna as it does in Cork. Why are there different fire regulations in every single... I think in Ireland there's something like 27 different fire regulations for 5 million people. There's something that's got to change. And so standardizing policy, which isn't new regulation, but it's actually thinning regulation, is where the focus is. And finding incentives that are both financial. Just this morning there was an announcement that the forthcoming or the incoming chancellor here in Germany is planning on 800 billion in investment in defense and infrastructure. That's an opportunity for the industrialized construction space to get up, and some of these prop tech startups to get up in front of that immediately and talk about how things can be solved and addressed sooner and faster.
Marc, you said sustainability is a topic which is close to your heart, right? So how do you see, I mean, sustainability obviously was also one of the drivers for the change in construction. With the taxonomy, of course, it's kind of, dialed back a bit. What's your take on this? I mean, are they doing enough? Is this still the driver, or is it now other sectors like defense or infrastructure?
No, we believe that those are companion evolution or changes. I mean, you cannot think industrialization or productization of construction without associating it to also the material. And the environmental footprint of the material is a parameter to make sure that we can actually tackle two topics at the same time. On one hand, the efficiency. On the other one, the sustainability, the recyclability, the durability, and the better modeling on the durability, and also the way you can repurpose a building is definitely where, as a software vendor, we should help. And all of that is about making sure that those two transformations are not two parallel universes, but they go with each other hand in hand.
My question would also be, I mean, if you talk about sustainability, right, why would you build new anyway? I mean, there's so much potential to kind of work with the existing building stock in Europe. There's so many things you could repurpose or, refurbish or, just use differently. Are we solving the wrong problem? Is it maybe better just to kind of work with the existing building stock instead of kind of creating, another set of, hundreds of thousands of new buildings in Europe? How much potential is there?
I would not oppose the two. Why? Because simply, out of the building stock, you get objects that were built with materials that we don't want anymore because they are not performing the way they should, and they could be actually replaced by things that are better in terms of building performance, but also in terms of durability and so on and so forth, and quality of living. So I would consider that the new is still to be, and is still having its own place. And then in the way you refurbish and remodel, the way we help to be able to better keep, is it 5, 10, 15, 20%, or even more than that, of the existing, it's of course very, very important, especially for structural element. We need, on our case, it's of course, then the technology is about reality capture that you take to the software, and the software helps you to keep and identify what are the structural elements you could keep, and then you can measure your avoidance in cubic meters of concrete and embodied carbon as well. So I would not oppose new to refurbishing. I would just treat them separately, but as we still need both, basically.
We need both. What's your take on this, working for a GC?
Completely agree with the point of view that was shared. And there are many initiatives that we see, for example, converting office buildings, abandoned office buildings to housing where a lot of the demand is. So those initiatives shouldn't be undermined. They're important. There are challenges, as I understand from different projects, in terms of time meeting the time deadlines, and also cost-wise, there are many challenges that retrofitting or repurposing also faces. So it shouldn't be undermined, but as you just mentioned, I think there is enough room for both to coexist, and it seems maybe new construction has the bigger proportion.
Okay. Let's talk about technology. Obviously, it's the first thing people talk about when they think about industrialized construction, right? They look at the robots who kind of run around the fair and kind of, the cool robots who print buildings in 3D. But what emerging technologies will have the biggest impact on the adoption of industrialized construction? David?
I'm going to say I'm not sure the technology matters, at least to begin with, because I think...
Any type of technology?
Any type of technology. Okay. Because I think the way that we are working together to design and deliver buildings today is so dysfunctional that there's an enormous amount of value simply by changing the way that we work together to avoid the duplication and the mistakes that are being made in the way that buildings are being designed. And that doesn't require much technology. It requires people to contract differently, and it requires people to work together in a fundamentally different way. Now, we can then, once we have that, we can then start to introduce the technology to help us to design better, to connect the designers to the available supply chain. I think the work that you're doing is very interesting in this space. And then, of course, from the manufacturers, they will progressively introduce more technology into their factories. They can go, but already a relatively low-tech modular factory will produce a better building than something that's delivered on site. Now, over the next decade, we'd love to see that lights out, robots working 24/7, but we don't need that today. Yeah, that we can have a predominantly hand-manufactured modular unit will already deliver a better outcome. And then as we start to scale, as that pipeline emerges, as people see the benefits, they change the way that we work, the manufacturers, the contractors, the architects, the engineers, the real estate developers will progressively introduce the technology. But I don't think that's what's going to move the needle. I think it's fundamentally changing the way that we work and the way that we trust each other.
Who's the bottleneck then?
I don't think it's so much the bottleneck. I would say that there is an opportunity for developers to unlock a huge amount of value in the way that their buildings are designed and delivered. And in particular, as we're listening to us talk, we still talk as though a building is a one-off, because today a building is a one-off. As we start to adopt these technologies, and as we start to adopt kits of parts approach, it becomes a series of buildings which are developed from a kit of parts. And so those parts will become better over time. The processes will become more efficient. So as a developer, if I'm looking at a decade's worth of work in multifamily living, there is an enormous opportunity. I'll make some money. Building 1 will be better, building 3 will be a lot better, and by the time I get to building 5, I'm minting it because my competitors are still working in a business as usual way. And I think that's where the opportunity is there's an awful lot of money on the table that people are anxious about trying to grab because there is a risk in doing things differently. But I think the onus is very much on the real estate developers because they're the ones who dictate the way that the project is organized.
And Marc, working for a software company, obviously you're also part of the technology stack if you want to enable this. And when you talk to, let's say, people in the industry, they often complain about, let's say, the big software companies basically just, building silos, right? So not opening up enough or not enough, offering enough interfaces to also other systems so that there's a more free flow of, let's say, new solutions, data, and so on. So what's Nemetschek's perspective on this? Do you see the need, maybe also the risk for you then to open up, create something which is allowing what David was saying on the organization level, also on the software level?
So, the interoperability between software vendors, the fact that when you have an engineering department of Implenia that wants to work with subcontractors or freelancers of their choices for, an energy analysis, a thermal model, they would want to work with a structural engineer of any kind. They want the possibility to be able to export and import a file without losing the data. And today, it's not really that easy to do it. So it's the entire software industry, and together with Building Smart International, that we have to make sure that we are, as Nemetschek, we are an advocate of open BIM. We believe in opening rich data format that will allow engineering data not to be lost not to get lost in translation, which is the case today. So that's the first, let's say, challenge, and our contribution to the industry is really to try to promote an interoperability supported by rich data format exchange between software vendors. And we owe it to the entire engineering and construction value chain. The second element is that today, I mean, when you start to design a house, I don't know, a hospital or whatever, the field of possibilities are in billions. And today our job is to reduce that variance, to reduce that complexity, to help those players to go to simplicity without letting the owner, investor, user feeling that he's getting less choices, less creativity. So we need to move our software from a classical CAD engineering to more a configurator, moving from billions of variants to probably tens of thousands of variants that would help to standardize material, to standardize subsystems in any buildings. So two challenges, interop, yes, but the other one is simplicity. So go completely in transforming the CAD into a configuration type of software, which is difficult.
It's difficult, absolutely. So we're moving towards the end. I also have some questions from the audience, which I want to then ask you. But one thing I'm interested in to understand is, I mean, what are the business models and the opportunities coming out of industrialized construction? Obviously, you hear a lot, right? Assembly as a service, field factories, cloud manufacturing, kit of parts. I mean, there's so many, again, like so much lingo out there, which is sometimes hard to understand. But what do you see kind of as the interesting models?
I'll talk about ours. So the idea of starting from scratch to build a house is like inviting someone to your driveway and build a car with somebody to come in for a chassis and somebody else to come in with some tires, somebody else to come in with an engine. We don't do that, right? We buy a car and optimized in various ways. So we've got optimized designs for multiple typologies of housing for the German, the Dutch, and the Belgian market right now. In BIM, pre-engineered, pre-designed with architects, engineers, satisfying in two-dimensional prefabricated timber. Then we have suppliers across Europe to be able to fulfill with an open supply chain, if you will. And we believe that this positions us, we're just in the midst of signing some first contracts because we're a startup, but we believe this positions us to solve 85 to 90% of a site's needs. If there's customization needed, you can fill that with your extra 5, 10, 15%, but we can satisfy with row houses, row house apartments, etc. The idea of a pre-designed, pre-engineered product, as Fedi said earlier, and then an open supply chain to be able to facilitate market by market by market, because that knowledge is quite often specifically local. So I think that that's a model that will work. That's why I've invested in it as an entrepreneur, and we look forward to hearing from you all about that.
I think it's incredibly exciting, actually, especially once we start to have good data. So to contradict myself and talk about the technology opportunities, once we start to have richer data on the buildings, because developers are using data over multiple buildings, then who knows what the business models will emerge. You know, I could rent you part of a building. I could rent you the steel in your building for 100 years because I know exactly what material is in the building, right? I could rent the carbon capture potential of the construction materials that you've used. You know, there's all kinds of, it's a bit like going back to the beginning of the internet and saying, well, you know, we've connected two computers, you know, what's this going to let us do? And you couldn't possibly have imagined how it's transformed our lives. And I think that's what's really exciting. Once we start to move to more open standards, more coherent sets of data, where we can start to use AI across buildings, I think there are a host of business models that we can't even imagine, and that's when it gets really exciting.
Cool, so I have some questions here from the audience. So one is, in other industries, 95% is industrialized and the other 5% is custom-made. In construction, it's the opposite, so that's the 2% that we talked about earlier. So what's the limit? What's the possibility in this industry? So how far can you go up? 95% or?
So in the UK, I think now 75% of construction projects, because of a mandate from the government, 75% of construction projects are done in BIM now. That's because the government mandated that. In Japan, 15%, you keep saying 2, but around the world we have different numbers. 15% of housing in Japan is done prefabricated, pre-engineered. So there's numbers that are ticking up all around. But I think you asked where the roadblocks. The roadblocks are anyone or any organization that's not open to think differently and doesn't have people asking those questions. So that's part of our job, is to be educators. We know this, but it's really actually to spend money, time, and effort to educate, which is why I went and spoke with the EU Commission.
So Fede, what do you say? I mean, you researched on this?
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, if you look at a whole building and how much of it could be industrialized, in our team we'd say about, in terms of volume, 40%. So 60% of a building can be standardized and prefabricated. Of course, you could do more, but from our analysis, we see that if you take a look at a hotel building, the rooms can be purely standardized, and you can take them to a factory setting, manufacture them, and bring them to site. Whereas the ground floor, where you have kitchen and so on, it's more project by project basis. The design or the client differs, and hence you can't really standardize it as easily as you would in terms of the rooms. And then the other part is the roof. So roof, ground floor, what we call supplemental design, take about 40%, the rest is about 60%. But if you want to take a look at what can be pre-built in terms of the rooms, let's say if you have a volumetric module, then it's normally 80-20%. So 80% of the
80%.
room
Okay.
can be prefabricated, and then there could be some assembly work that you do on site, so could be 20% or less.
Okay. Good. So another question I have here is, how long is the way from prefab walls to industrialized? And we have 2 or 3 minutes left, so we need to keep it brief, but I just still want to answer the questions. How long is the way from prefab walls to industrialized construction? So from kind of the panelized way, to kind of fully like what you're saying. So basically the same question, just kind of, what are the steps? Like, how much time does it go from like where you are right now to, let's go 40% all the way to 80%?
I mean, just to quickly answer, and then I think I let the others then follow. I don't think you have to go all the way to 80 or 100%. I think it depends, right? So we use both panelized system and volumetric systems, and both have advantages and disadvantages. So it doesn't really mean you have to go from 2D to 3D all the time in all cases.
Exactly, and I think that's a key point, is that industrialized design and construction is about the way we work, about the way we use the digital technologies and the manufacturing technologies, and the way we use data. So, from our perspective, whether it's 1D post and beam, or 2D panelized, or 3D volumetric that's not fitted out or fitted out, those are all industrialized and design and construction solutions. you know, and it's about finding the right mix of prefabricated systems. So I think the 95/5 sounds right for prefabricated, but I'd go everything can be industrialized design and construction 100% because it's about the way that you about the way that you go about approaching the project. So I hope that in 50 years from now, when we're fully industrialized, in some instances, we'll still be using panels. We'll still be using panelized systems on projects where that's appropriate.
That's actually a follow-up question for you. What do you mean exactly by changing the way we work? So that's what you said before, you know. So it's not about technology; it's more about how we're working together.
Yeah, well,
can you just like give like two examples, for example? What's the differences?
Talk about trust. So there's a problem on a project. So we always have problems on projects. Today, the incentive, because of the contracting and insurance structures, is us to fight over who's going to fix it. And we spend more time fighting over who's fixing it, probably, than getting it fixed. If we can change that so that we have a problem which is going to affect our bonus, our focus now is on how do we fix this. And I don't care if you do it, I do it, or he does it. It's about solving the problem so that we can deliver ahead of schedule, ahead of budget, and get our bonus. And that's a fundamental shift in the way that people behave. And it requires trust, and that's a big issue.
Cool, thank you. So one last question for you. Ethiopia, where you're from, obviously you also have a housing crisis there, like all over Africa, I guess, in many places. So is there like an effort to I'm just reading the question, to build houses with kind of recycling plastic or recycled material to kind of, build faster or maybe, build more sustainably or basically taking, the trash and basically using it as a building material?
Yes, there's actually a company called Cubic. I don't know if any of you heard about it, but it's based in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, and they actually do exactly that. But I mean, that's just one company, right? It's not practiced in the markets yet, but there are initiatives that try to do that. And yeah, there is a huge housing demand. And I think, as they mentioned earlier, there are different motivators to different governments to adopt industrialized construction. And housing demand is a motivator, but there are other parts, for example, high unemployment rate that would inhibit the adoption of industrialized construction in the case of Ethiopia and other countries. So there are different factors that play in the adoption of industrialized construction, and we have to wait and see what governments and the industry does. Yeah.
Very good, thank you. So we're on time, and I think there's no more question left here. Yeah, so thank you all for joining me. Thank you all for joining us. Obviously, some already left for the lunch. We're going to do the same thing now. So thanks and see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.